And we're live again with bad morning news. A bad morning to all of you who are listening to this on this slightly overcast in my town 30th of July. We made it through the Independence Day month. We made it through Americans being American, and we made it through half of the year. So, well, actually, a month over half the year anyway. Anyway, y'all are gonna have an interesting show this morning. We're gonna start with some UK news, but with some housekeeping to get out of the way. We've got this is sponsored by Brave. It's the ad-resistant, track-resistant browsing experience that supports creators like us at the same time. And it's also brought to you by the Cash App, Federal Reserve Note, and Bitcoin wallet that you can get a Visa card to spend. And the Liberty mugs, which are mugs you can use to piss off your coworkers. So feel free to get any of those. Liberty mugs now has beer steins that are large in glass and look cool. So if you want, for instance, the Bitcoin one, it's got a big Bitcoin logo on a beer mug, so you could carry that around your house or have that in your podcast or whatever. I would highly recommend. Anyway, that said, I think that's pretty much all of it out of the way. For those of you who don't know, Bad Morning News is exactly what it sounds like. It is your antidote to that mind pablum that they want you to watch before you go to your corporate job so that you're nice, pacified worker. So we're not that. And in order to get us started off on that, Lupinit has an article from Business Insider for us to make a transformative work on here.
Yeah, bad morning, everybody. So yeah, I've got a good starter here. This is basically from Business Insider UK. All the bad news Theresa May's government just tried to bury. May's government quietly slips out a long trail of inconvenient announcements as MPs head for parliamentary recess. The highlights of which are EU will continue to apply for years as law after Brexit, despite May's promise otherwise. Courts and military bases to be sold off. Funding for free nursery milk is set to be cut. Childhood obesity is an all-time high, and May's government is accused of burying bad news over the summer. So let's just go right on in there. A rather cynical tradition has developed in recent years in which, in the final days and hours before MPs leave Parliament for an extended break, the government releases a deluge of embarrassing reports, statistics, and statements in an apparently deliberate attempt to bury them. This summer has been no different. Here are just some of the inconvenient stories Theresa May's government has tried to bury over the past 24 hours. EU law will apply for years after Brexit. Theresa May promised that all EU law and their jurisdiction of EU courts would end after Brexit Day. However, May's government on Tuesday slipped out a new white paper, revealing that ministers will legislate to ensure EU law continues to apply for at least 2 years after Britain leaves in March 2019. As Brexiteer MPs head off to their constituencies, the new Brexit Secretary, Dominic Raab, revealed that the government will implement legislation that will allow the European Communications Acts, which ministers plan to repeal on Brexit Day, to be extended to allow EU rules to remain in force during any 2-year transition. This means European courts will also continue to have jurisdiction over the UK in a breach of previous promises by the Prime Minister. This is a victory for those hoping to delay or cancel Brexit, but will undoubtedly prompt anger amongst many Brexiteers. RAF bases will be sold off. May's government is repeatedly committed to protect the British military from cuts. However, an announcement slipped out on Tuesday afternoon revealed that 2 RAF bases will now close their gates for the final time under a series of planned cuts by the government. RAF Linton on House in North Yorkshire, which is used as a training ground for pilots, will cease operation from 2020. Meanwhile, RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire, which is home to the RAF Aerobatics team, will be sold off in 2022. The cuts are part of wider long-term cuts planned to sell off military sites used by RAF and armed forces. Childhood obesity has surged to an all-time high. The Prime Minister has repeatedly promised to tackle childhood obesity with measures including a new sugar tax and health advice brought in by ministers. However, new government report slipped out as MPs leave Westminster for the summer, reveals that their attempts so far have failed. New figures published on Tuesday afternoon show that severe obesity among 10 and 11-year-olds is now at a record high, with children in the poorest families showing the biggest rise. Overall, the health inequality gap between children in poorer, wealthier families has also widened once again. Theresa May has just demoted her new Brexit secretary. David Davis's resignation as Brexit secretary led speculation that Downing Street could move to take over Brexit talks from whoever succeeded him. That speculation turned out to be correct, with the Prime Minister quietly announcing on Tuesday afternoon that the Brexit department will no longer be in charge of negotiations, with Downing Street and the Cabinet Office leading instead. I will negotiate with the European Union, with the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union deputizing on my behalf, May said in a statement. The decision means the Brexit department will now be downgraded, with staff moving over to Downing Street and the Cabinet Office. Both of us will be supported by the Cabinet Office, European Unit, and with this in mind, the European Union will have overall responsibility for preparation and conduct of the negotiations, drawing upon support from DEXEU and other departments as required. A number of staff will transfer from DEXEU to the Cabinet Office to deliver that. Courts will be sold off. The Conservative government attempts to slash public spending has led to widespread cuts to public services. These cuts today were extended further into the court system, as May's government quietly announced plans to sell off courts across England as part of a wider cost-cutting exercise. The following 7 courts will now be closed after government officials judged they no longer represented, quote, value for money. Bainbury Magistrates and County Court, Blackfriars Crown Court, Chorley Magistrates Court, Fleetwood Magistrates Court, Maidenhead Magistrates Court, Northallerton Magistrates Court, and Wandsworth County Court. And finally, free nursery milk programs face cuts. When Margaret Thatcher cut free school milk in the schools in 1970s, when she was Education Secretary, she was dubbed the, quote, milk snatcher by her opponents. Now, as Parliament prepares to head off for the summer, Theresa May's government is reportedly planning something similar for nursery school children. The plans to cut funding for free milk in nurseries were revealed by The Times on Tuesday and will be set out in an imminent public consultation. A spokesperson for the Prime Minister insisted to Business Insider that no child who currently receives milk will lose access to it. However, there is likely to be cuts of some form of the program, potentially in terms of the quality or quantity of milk provided. And that pretty much wraps that one up. So yeah, lots of little bits of news that the government would kind of like quietly just sort of people to stew about for a bit until they're out of their summer recess.
Yeah, fucking while you were reading that, I like could not help once you got to the courts thing, where it started to talk about how they no longer represented value for money. I could not help thinking that May was trying to be Thatcher. And then what does she do? Well, milk, fantastic. I mean, I think that really represents a lot of what Theresa May has been trying to accomplish. She wants to be Thatcher 2.0, but she's doing a really, really bad job of it.
Well, Thatcher knew her Sun Tzu, and May just seems to have forgotten it, unfortunately. You negotiate from positions of strength. You don't negotiate yourself into a position of weakness, which unfortunately does seem like what the white paper has been doing to a very extreme extent.
And also moving it into a smaller office. I mean, the whole idea of taking essentially the future of your country with the alliances that it could or could not form and downgrading anything seems like a really dumb thing to do from a status perspective. But
this is the thing. She wants to have a bit more, I think, of a driving factor in how those discussions are going to be made and those decisions are going to be made. Because every time She's outsourced this. It's come back and blown up in her face. So maybe she's trying that route to get some better control over the negotiation. Personally, I think it's a Hail Mary.
Well, hey, I mean, if it did come home, it would be one of the only things that does this year, eh?
It'd be the only thing that'd be worth getting to come home at the moment. Simply, if she could get it to work, if she could get it to deal, basically hammer it out, that was beneficial,
That
then she could recover it all in one fell
yeah.
swoop. That's the thing about politics. If you win big.
Yeah, well,
But if
that
you
was a
lose, you
football
lose it
joke.
all.
So.
Yeah.
But anyway, in a similar way, let's read this piece from Activist Post. Housing crash 2.0. Experts warn that the U.S. housing market looks headed for its worst slowdown in years. This is from Michael Snyder at Activist Post. It says, is the U.S. headed for another absolutely devastating housing crash? It has been 10 years since the last one, and so many of the exact same signs that immediately preceded the last one are starting to appear once again. Back in 2007, home prices were absolutely soaring, and it seemed like the party would never end. But interest rates went up, home sales slowed down substantially, and eventually prices began to crash. Millions upon millions of Americans were suddenly underwater in their homes just as crippling recession hit the economy, and we plunged into a foreclosure crisis unlike anything that we had ever seen before. Well, now the cycle is happening again. Home prices surged to unprecedented heights in 2017, and this was especially true in the hottest markets on the east and west coasts. But now interest rates are going up and home sales are starting to slow down substantially. We certainly aren't too far away from the next crash and another horrible foreclosure crisis, and many experts are beginning to sound the alarm. For example, the following very alarming numbers come from a recent Bloomberg article entitled, quote, the U.S. housing market looks headed for its worst slowdown in years. Excerpt is here. Existing home sales dropped in June for a third straight month. Purchases of new homes are at their slowest pace in 8 months. Inventory, which plunged for years, has begun to grow again as buyers move to the sidelines, sapping the fuel for surging home values. Prices for existing homes climbed 6.4% in May, the smallest year-over-year gain since early 2017, and have gained the least over 3 months since 2012, according to the Federal Housing Finance Agency. Those are definitely troubling figures, but perhaps even more disturbing is the fact that mortgage applications are way down right now. Mortgage applications to purchase both new and existing homes have been falling steadily, and mortgage rates are rising again. Single-family home construction also fell and was lower than June 2017. Of course, economic numbers always go up and down, and just because we've had a few bad months doesn't necessarily mean that disaster is looming. But when you step back and take a broader perspective on the housing market, it really does start to feel like early '08 all over again. In fact, Nobel Prize winning author Robert Shiller says that this could be the very beginning of a turning point. So it looks like it might be headed for a similar thing. I don't know that they've been selling a whole lot of junk loans, though. Like, I don't know that they've been selling a whole lot of subprime mortgages and shit. And, so I wonder if they'll be able to bounce back from this faster, and if this is just, essentially bubble news. Like, there's a bubble that's popping. Fantastic. That happens all the time.
Well, there are a couple of concerns I've got because I have followed a different set of loans that is bubbling far worse than the housing market at the moment. That's the auto loan market. It's been subprime for some time in the States, and
Okay.
it's a baby canary basically to the bigger canary that is housing.
Well, I mean, is it even a bigger canary though? I mean, at this point, with the housing market being where it is.
It is, because at least from a subprime perspective, I don't know so much. Yeah. See, the problem is I don't know if the housing market is really subprime. When the last crash started happening, I remember flying back to the States briefly and hearing on the radio all sorts of things about how you need to protect yourself from being in a subprime mortgage situation. There was
Right.
loads of adverts on how to protect yourself from subprime mortgage issues. And that had been going on for years. I don't, because I'm not there, I don't know if that is still, if they're doing those types of ads. You'd be able to answer that better than me. But if they're doing that type of ad, that means that the market's back for that. If the market's back for that, then there is a subprime issue. So you
Yeah,
can
well,
probably answer it fairly quickly by telling me what kind of radio advertising they've been doing over there.
Well, I mean, I should start by saying I don't listen to the radio much, but what I can also say is that from what I see a lot on both the television and radio, there seems to be that same spike in, buy now, and it would be perfect timing because we have another Republican president and they could hang it around his neck. So it does seem possible, and not only possible, but like basically a repeat of '08 and basically a repeat of Reagan. So I mean, maybe we'll get Trumponomics now. Who knows? But
The,
certainly the only thing that we need is not to have Bushonomics.
there's another article I found which actually ties into that quite well because I'm not certain we know. I don't think anybody can claim at this point to know what Trump is thinking at any point in time because he changes so quickly on everything. It's like trying to follow a it's like trying to follow a cheetah in in this kind of market at the moment. It's a bit difficult to keep on top of him. But there was an article from the American Thinker that I found regarding this, which had to do. Oh, what was it? I'm trying to find the damn thing now. Did I share it with you? Yes, I did. About the Chinese and Trump.
Ah, okay, yeah.
So, meanwhile, the Chinese think Trump's a genius. Has anyone ever called the Chinese stupid? Not those guys. So now they're reading President Trump, and unlike the childish Eurotrash of Western Europe, they see a shrewd, wily, chess-playing Sun Tzu-grade genius who could easily checkmate them, and they've got a lot of reasons for thinking so. That's the report for the European Policy Domo, who actually went to Beijing and asked the local leaders what they were saying. The report that the European Council for Foreign Relations President Mark Leonard gives in the Financial Times is well worth a subscription or trial subscription to read it. Some of his thoughts from the piece can be read on Instapundit, however. Here's a bit of what Glenn Reynolds posted. I've just spent a week in Beijing talking to officials and intellectuals, many of whom are awed by his skill as a strategist and a tactician. Few Chinese think that Mr. Trump's primary concern is to rebalance the bilateral trade deficit. If it were, they say, he would have aligned with EU, Japan, and Canada against China, rather than scooping up America's allies in his tariff dragnet. They think the US president's goal is nothing less than remaking the global order. They think Mr. Trump feels he is presiding over the relative decline of his great nation. It is not the current order it's not that the current order does not benefit the U.S. The problem is that it benefits others in more relative terms. To make things worse, the U.S. is investing billions of dollars and a fair amount of blood in supporting the very alliances and international institutions that are constraining America and facilitating China's rise. In Chinese eyes, Mr. Trump's response is a form of, quote, creative destruction. He is systematically destroying the existing institutions, from the World Trade Organization and the North American Free Trade Agreement to NATO and the Iran nuclear deal, as a first step towards renegotiating the world order on terms more favorable to Washington. Once the order is destroyed, the Chinese elite believes Mr. Trump will move to stage two, renegotiating America's relationship with other powers. Because the US is still the most powerful country in the world, it will be able to negotiate with other countries from a position of strength if it deals with them one at a time, rather than through multilateral institutions that empower the weak at the expense of the strong. My interlocutors say that Mr. Trump is the US first president for more than 40 years to bash China on three fronts simultaneously: trade, military, and ideology. They describe him as a master tactician, focusing on one issue at a time and extracting as many concessions as he can. They speak skillfully of the way Mr. Trump has treated President Xi Jinping. Look how he handled North Korea, one says. He got Xi Jinping to agree to UN sanctions half a dozen times. Sorry, one sec. Creating an economic stranglehold on the country. China almost turned North Korea into a sworn enemy of the country. But they also see him as a strategist willing to declare a truce in each area when there are no more concessions to be had, and then starting with a new front. Wow. So Chinese watched the Trump dramas back in Singapore and Brussels and Helsinki closely and drew their own conclusions as to what was going on from them. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer, as Sun Tzu used to say. The slap around of Justin Trudeau in Canada, the rapprochement with North Korea's dictator Kim Jong-un in Singapore, the second slap around at NATO's headquarters in Belgium, and the love fest between Vladimir Putin and Finland had quite an effect in China, where locals recognized the dictum in action. What a coincidence, Trump happens to be a student of Sun Tzu, the famous Chinese strategist who wrote The Art of War. Apparently, the Chinese didn't see a madman, and being pals with Kim, we don't think the Chinese aren't well experienced with so-called madmen, the way the Europeans and the US left did. They saw a power player, someone intent on taking down the world order that the US pays full freight on and yet gets very little from. After all, who cleaned up after the Iraq War was fought with US blood and treasure, along with its dragged out, unwilling allies, and then got all the oil? The Chinese, of course. Naturally, this means that up until now, they've considered the US a sucker. Note that the Chinese guy Leonard quotes is the very calm, now former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, He Yafei, who had fun browbeating President Obama openly in Copenhagen a few years ago, and Obama just took it. He's not talking the same way about Trump. It goes on a little bit more with regards to Sun Tzu and basically Trump's support. And to be fair to listeners, American Thinker is right-leaning. I will not deny that in the slightest. But it's interesting to get an alternative perspective from what we in the media, what we in the West see from the media. Because if China feels that, I mean, if China is saying this sort of thing, or if Asia is basically looking at Trump and going, did not expect this.
Keep something in mind that this sort of outlet is the sort of outlet that's jingoistic enough to monolithize somebody because of what a few people there said. I would like to know the majority of the opinion in China through an unfiltered lens. And through a lens that's not biased by fear of reprisal, but I'd also like to travel to the zones in Sonic and actually collect some Chaos Emeralds. So I don't think either of those things are going to happen. And realistically, I think that this is, if it is at all a representation of the people, it's a representation of the people in much the same way that the MAGAists are a representation of the American people. They're a representation of a significant enough chunk to make an article, but not a significant enough chunk to say that this is what, quote, China believes. So it's really good to remember that these nations are comprised of many different people of many different mindsets, and that not all of them are going to believe one thing. I mean, that's my general takeaway from that. Plus, if this, because I've been saying it for a while now, Trump is only dismantling what already needed to be dismantled. He's only cutting the fat. And so in terms of Art of War, if he's fighting for the good guys, proverbially speaking, then yeah, this article makes sense. But if he's not fighting for the good guys, then the article also makes sense, because the Art of War would just be that they were trying to make it seem as though Trump was against the elites, when Trump was with the elites from the start, cutting the fat and throwing people under the bus so that the institutions could run more smoothly, that would stick around afterward. So I would be wary of anything that immediately assumed that Trump wasn't. Well, I'm saying that mostly for the audience. Anybody who might be new to this show, I don't want them to get the feeling that that this is just a show that's going to suck off Trump. But at the same time, if he is working for the good guys, which is to me such a low percentage possibility, then every likelihood that this will result in the next thing that I'm talking about, which is an article from Sputnik, a Russian outlet.
Oh, goody.
And this is well, I like Sputnik a lot. I think that they're much less biased than a lot of other outlets. It's sort of like
Yep.
how people. It's sort of like how people are like, oh, Russia Today, that's funded by the Russian government. Well, sure, but it also has some of the best, least biased stock footage of war that anybody is welcome to use.
Yeah.
It also has like reporting from people like Abby Martin still there. So I mean, the fact that they haven't slashed and burned all their alternative news people, the fact that you can still find Adam Kokesh on their channel, even though he's been through some scandals, I would say that that has a decent amount of I don't know, reputation building power for them being an alternative news source. Um, but on that level, this is from Sputnik, and it's Trump reportedly ready to strike Iran next month as War of Worlds escalates. Now, before I get into this article, I wanted to preface this by saying to everybody who's been with this program for a while and been with my channel for even longer, that this is exactly what I was talking about when I discussed Bilderberg and the fact that they were discussing Iran as a separate topic from Russia and China. From the previous article, if you start to look at this as a global chessboard instead of the US being one player, but the entire global powers being one player, it starts to look sort of similar to this, where you start to see all of these sorts of things aligning in terms of their ability to produce the next warfare state. So on that level, this article reads, and I've been saying for a while that that I think war with Iran is very likely, and that they're building a smart city right next to it to justify all of it and to have an intelligence hub near there. But all of that aside, the article reads, according to ABC broadcaster, Australian defense facilities and UK intelligence services might assist the United States in identifying Iran's nuclear targets. Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said, however, he had no reason to believe the United States was preparing for the operation. Last week, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani cautioned Trump not to play with the lion's tail after U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had pledged to persuade U.S. allies to halt purchases of Iranian oil by November. Commenting on Rouhani's remark, Trump warned that the Iranian president warned the Iranian president of severe consequences if he continued to make threats toward the U.S. The already tense relations between Iran and the United States took a nosedive in May after Trump announced the U.S. withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, and reimposed sanctions against Tehran, which had been lifted under the JCPOA in exchange for curbing its nuclear program. So it's a relatively short article, but it has a lot there. So there's a decent amount of like worry to be had here. There's a decent amount of concern to possibly be had with reference to Trump's worsening relations with Iran, theoretically. Now, there are already people on the right saying that this is just to be fair and balanced, whatever. TM, as Cody Johnson would say, fucking, there are already people on the right who are saying that essentially this is the same sort of fear propaganda they were ratcheting up against North Korea, and they said, well, North Korea went much better than the mainstream media wanted you to believe, so what about this? Why wouldn't this also go well? Well, maybe because Bilderberg was discussing this. Maybe because if you want to go on the QAnon level, there's a decent amount of possible problems that could arise from this that aren't problems for a warfare state or for a security state or anything similar to that. And maybe they're building a city nearby there too. But like, I'd like your take as
Careful with
well.
using, yeah, I mean, there's, if we're going to go down the QAnon route, there's something to consider that recently he posted, which
Go
Let's
for
put it
it.
this way. It threw me for a loop because hang on, I've got to find the damn thing because the wording is important. There were things that there were specific phrases that I would never have expected a member of any government organization to ever say. Okay? This is quite unique in a way. It was not something that it's not something that you would normally see. Let's put it that way. Let me see if I can find it. There we go. Uh, the usual sort of stuff is like patriots are united in the pursuit of common goals, good versus evil, right versus wrong, humanity. And then there's this line: power over another person is not okay. Patriots are not divided. Borders do not separate us. We fight stronger together. We are stronger together. We the people, where we go one, we go all. Q. That it looks like that came from one of the proper trip codes, and it came from a title called To Be Determined. Voluntarist undertones in a Q post. I did not expect to see that. I did not see that coming, ever,
Well,
in a million years.
I mean, I can see this being very useful. First off, if we've got this quote, no borders patriotism, that's just so long as the other nations play nice with Trump. If the other nations start to play unnice with the US, those borders will start to seem much more tantalizing to the people who support Q. So maybe that is the way the Q thing is for now. And this is just me like being generous and saying that this isn't all a conspiracy. But if Q is legitimate, then it makes a whole lot of sense to assume that the possibility exists that Q is specifically saying that as long as everything keeps on going according to the plan, hashtag trust the plan.
Yeah.
Then we don't need to worry about borders. We don't need to worry about any foreign nations. Daddy Trump has us covered.
Potentially. I was more focused on the it's not okay for people to rule other people. That
Okay,
one,
then why are they saying patriots?
I don't know. Probably to make people at least. There are certain words that it uses emotional triggers. Patriot is one of them, and it works. So you use what works, and you phrase what you're going to say very, very carefully, because those words will trigger certain responses, or people will key up bots to notify them when those words are used.
I mean,
So
yeah, but like the term
that's
patriot
part of it.
but the term patriot has patri in it for a reason, and it's because it goes back to the fatherland mindset, and it goes back to the nationalist sort of mentality. So I mean, I don't know how using a word like that would reject rulership. It seems like it wants to, cement loyalism, not reject it.
Oh, cement loyalism. I'm not saying that it's not working towards loyalty. That is part of its purpose. But the follow-up statement that comes after is more promising, and not one I
Maybe.
expected to see from a government official.
I mean, I could see
Particularly
that
one
being.
with Q clearance.
Well, I mean, but here's the thing: if that is the case, if this is a government official, there's a likelihood that using language similar to that is designed to make the next actions seem reasonable because they're defending a little guy somewhere, arming and defending rebels that are being quote ruled or having force used against them in this particular case, wording language, blah. Would be a huge step in the right direction for fomenting like support for a Trump action arming rebels. So I would advise against immediately assuming that this is that. But why don't you go into your article like after you respond to this from the Last American Vagabond about I traced Al Qaeda missile casings in Syria.
Oh, that one. I mean, the core article from that's actually from The Independent.
Okay, well then reading that would be fine. Because like I think that ties nicely into this. If what I think is correct, we're going, well, the US is going to war in the Middle East, and really, really soon.
This is the thing. This is more complicated than that. This is based on what he's already been working on, as it were.
Right,
so
but like in general, people following these trails will find profit from wars pretty much all the time. So that's the point I was making.
I see. Okay. Well, Robert Fisk is an investigative journalist from The Independent, and he did quite a lot of work stopping the Syrian conflict from expanding even further when everybody was demanding mass action from Trump, most recently against Assad. And that particular incident did cause Trump to launch a missile salvo, I think, against Assad on certain locations, which didn't thankfully increase the conflict any further because everybody by that point was questioning the main narrative of, did Assad actually do anything in that area, because there's no benefit to him gassing it. And Robert Fisk went into that area and actually discovered loads of tunnels and hideaways, basically, that the insurgents used, and found loads of arms, and even more incriminating, the paperwork for them. So, to put it from the last American Vagabond's perspective, Robert Fisk, I traced Al Qaeda missile casings in Syria back to their original sellers. Finally, a journalist from mainstream UK media outlets is methodically tracking weapons shipment serial numbers and English language paperwork recovered from Al Qaeda groups in Syria, and he's literally showing up at arms factories and questioning arms dealers, including officials at the Saudi embassy in London, asking, "Why are your weapons in the hands of terrorists?" Veteran Middle East war correspondent Robert Fisk recently published a bombshell report entitled, "I trace missile casings in Syria back to their original sellers, so it's time for the West to reveal who they sell arms to." In it, Fisk recalls a bit of detective sleuthing he's lately been engaged in after stumbling upon a batch of missile casings and shipment paperwork last year, hidden in what he described as, quote, "the basement of a bombed-out Islamic base in eastern Aleppo," with the words Hughes Aircraft Co. / guided missile surface attack emblazoned on the side of the spent tubes. Of course, the Syrian government recaptured the area from Islamist insurgents, including al-Nusra terrorists and their allies, in December 2016, and has made rapid gains throughout the country's east and south ever since. And Fisk has been trekking around the country to see what he can find. His, quote, detective story, as he calls it, seems to solicit the help of the public and begins as follows. Readers, small detective story. Note down this number, MFG BGM-71E-1B, and this number, stock no 1410-01-300-0254, and this code, DAA A10C-0292. I found all these numerals printed on the side of a spent missile casing lying out in the basement of a bombed-out Islamic base in eastern Aleppo last year. At the top of the words were Hughes Aircraft Co., founded in California back in the 1930s by the infamous Howard Hughes and sold in 1997 to Raytheon, the massive defense contractor whose profits last year came to 23.35 billion, or 18 billion pounds. Shareholders include the Bank of America and Deutsche Bank. Raytheon's Middle Eastern offices can be found in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Egypt, Turkey, and Kuwait. There were dozens of other used-up identical missile casings in the same underground room in the ruins of eastern Aleppo, with sequential coatings. In other words, these anti-armor missiles, known in the trade as TOWs, tube-launched optically tracked wire-guided missiles. And basically, then there's a picture of the actual code and everything else, all the different numbers. The serial number, interestingly enough, looks like it's been slightly damaged, which is a bit telling. The past year especially has seen an uptick in such systemic attempts to trace foreign supplied weapons on the Syrian battlefield, most of them recovered from internationally designated terrorist groups, even ISIS, back to their origination points. We've previously detailed a number of these reports. For example, journalists interrogated firing for story linking CIA and Syria weapons flight, as well as weapons went from the CIA to ISIS in less than 2 months. The latter based on extensive arms tracking and field forensics produced by Conflict Armament Research. Robert Fisk, however, represents a rare instance of a prominent journalist on a lone mission to trace weapon serial numbers recovered from their foreign-backed Syrian insurgency back to their origins in the United States. Worrisome for the U.S. intelligence and military leaders, as The Guardian has called him one of the most famous journalists in the world for being unrelenting in his investigations. Fisk continues by relating the moment he confronted former Hughes Aircraft, now Raytheon executive, about finding their product in the hands of terrorists. Some time ago in the United States, I met an old Hughes Aircraft executive who laughed when I told him my story of finding missiles in eastern Aleppo. When the company was sold, Hughes had been split into 8 components, he said, but assuredly this batch of rockets had left from a U.S. government base. Amateur sleuths may have already tracked down the first set of numbers above. The 01 in the stock number is a NATO coding for the U.S., and the BGM-71E is a Raytheon Systems company product. There's videos of Islamist fighters using BGMs-71E-1B variety in Idlib province 2 years before I found the casings of other anti-tank missiles in the neighboring Aleppo. As for the code DAA-A01C-0292, I'm still trying to trace this number. Fisk writes further that even if he doesn't ultimately come up with the American base from which the missiles originated, as well as the specific factory where they were made, he knows one thing for sure, that both Hughes Raytheon and the U.S. government have erected a paper trail system designed to shield them from violating anti-terror laws. He explains of this legal cover, quote, "This missile will have been manufactured and sold by Hughes Raytheon absolutely legally to a NATO, pro-NATO, or, quote, friendly, i.e. pro-American power, government, defense ministry, you name it. And there will exist for it an end-user certificate, an EUC, a document of impeccable provenance which will be signed by the buyers, in this case by the chaps who purchased the TOW missiles in very large numbers, stating that they are the final recipients of the weapons. And yet there is no actual way of knowing the official, quote, recipients identified as the, quote, end user are in fact the end users, as Fisk's investigation proves." Sorry, I stumbled over there. For the fact that he found a missile batch in a former Nusra ISIS Al-Qaeda stronghold. How many of these advanced Raytheon-made weapons does Al-Qaeda still have in its possession? Does anyone in Washington or London even care? He points out that, quote, "There is neither an obligation nor an investigative mechanism on the part of the arms manufacturers to ensure that their infinitely expensive products are not handed over by the buyers to ISIS, al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, which is clearly the case in Aleppo, or some other anti-Assad Islamist group in Syria branded by the U.S. State Department itself as a terrorist organization." So much for the U.S. anti-terror material support laws, huh? Naturally, Fisk follows up with an appropriately sarcastic quip. Of course, the weapons might have been sent, illegally under the terms of the unenforceable EUC, to a nice, cuddly, quote, moderate militia, like the now largely non-existent, quote, Free Syrian Army, many of whose weapons, generally donated by the West, have fallen into the hands of the bad guys, i.e. the folk who want to overthrow the Syrian regime, which would please the West, but who would like to set up an Islamist cult dictatorship in its place, which would not please the West. Indeed, it confirms what former MI6 spy and British diplomat Alistair Crook once stated, that the CIA knowingly established the basis of a, quote, jihadi Walmart of sorts, to which ISIS had immediate and easy access. Crook noted that the weapons program was set up with plausible deniability in mind, which would allow its American intelligence sponsors to be shielded from any potential future legal prosecution or public embarrassment. There's a number, I mean, it does go on for quite a while, actually. It's quite a bit more to this.
Well, the links will be in the description because we have to wrap up shortly. But I did want to say, tomorrow I've got a couple of articles for the show that should delve relatively well into the idea here. And one of them is about Trump and NATO. One of them is about the TSA's Secret Skies program, which is a very interesting thing. But both of those discuss, at least in minor detail, how this relates to this sort of thing. And I would recommend everybody read the rest of that piece. But in general, like generally speaking, I would recommend thinking of this sort of thing as a, CYA for weapons contractors who've made a decent amount off of the wars that are started with the weapons that they happen to lose. So,
from my view, it's good that there is an investigative journalist who seems to be hell-bent on a mission here to actually track this stuff down. And I'm hoping that more will follow, because it's important to know.
And I agree with that. But at the same time, you have to avoid falling into, because one of the first things you learn in tradecraft is the idea that the more you make somebody work for something, the more genuine that thing will appear. So if this guy works all his life to find the origins of these things, when he finds them, they might be the wrong origins, and he might have just wasted all his energy while they were building him rabbit trails. So I hope he's a good enough investigator. And I don't know him, so I'm not saying that I know whether he is or not, but I hope he's a good enough investigator to know when he's being had.
Well, I'd like to think so. He seems to be fairly clued up on it, at least.
Yeah. But anyway, this has been Bad Morning News. This is episode 9. Be sure to tune in tomorrow, where we're going to bring you general updates on the articles that we talked about today, and also give you updates on whatever news happens to come up between now and then. So that, I guess, is a good place to sign off and say smash the state, fuck the system, and be your own person.
Have a bad morning, y'all.
Bad morning.